Have you ever gotten into an argument about which is more popular, acrylic or wool? Have you ever wondered whether continental style knitting is actually more popular than English style knitting? And do you ever ask yourself, which brand of needles is actually the most coveted? Through the magic of publicly available data, we can settle some of knitting's biggest controversies once and for all. Now don't worry, you don't have to look at my treadmill over here for much longer. I'm going to share my screen with you and we're going to go through some stuff together. To do our comparisons, we'll be leveraging something called Google Trends. You might be familiar with it, but it's basically a service provided by Google. It's a free to use dashboard and you can put in any sort of search term and it will return a graph showing the popularity of that search term over time. On the homepage, it has some examples of things that are trending lately, and then it links to some articles about why they might be trending. So we're gonna hit explore and we're going to start looking some stuff up. So let's just pick a random word and chuck it in here. So for example, yarn. This is currently set to the past 12 months, but we're gonna switch it to be 2004 to present. This is the beginning to the left and it goes all the way through till today. The y-axis of this graph along the left-hand side is showing the relative interest in this term compared to all the other searches over time. So 100 would be when it is at its most popular, and then 0 would be when it's at its least popular. I can see two really interesting trends for this yarn graph. One, there's an overall curve downwards in the mid-2010s and then back up to now. So this term yarn is about as popular now as it was in 2004. But you can also see this really interesting up and down every year. It basically bottoms out in around June and then peaks in around December or January every year. You might be able to guess why, but I'll give you another chance if you can't. I'll switch this to Australia. And that way it will filter out all the search popularity from all the other countries and it will just show us the Australian search popularity. And so here you can see that the popularity in the word yarn has actually risen over time. And I plan to make a video about why that is. But you can still see that yearly up and down trend cycle. However, it's the other way around. So it's most popular in around June and least popular in December, January time. So the reason we were getting that trend in the worldwide graph the other way around was that, as you can see down here, North America and Europe makes up quite a large portion of the searches for yarn. And of course, December and January are winter months in the Northern Hemisphere. And so that's when people are likely going to be more interested in knitting. As compared to in Australia, our seasons are the other way around. So December and January is the height of summer for us. So I imagine fewer people are interested in knitting at that time. So you can also use this map to actually drill down a little bit easier. So you can see here that Nigeria has an interest. You can click on Nigeria and it will show you just the Nigerian results, and you can actually drill down into all like provinces, states, or regions of a particular country. You can also look on the right here and it will show you where the terms are most popular. So as I said, Canada comes in at the top, United States is closely behind, then New Zealand and Australia. So if I filtered just by United States, I would expect there to be an even steeper seasonal change in the searches for the word yarn. And you can drill down into various states. So I would imagine somewhere like Wisconsin would have a higher search rate and obviously longer winters than somewhere a little warmer, like let's say Texas. It also provides you related queries, so things that people search for when they also search for yarn, and other related topics according to Google. So you can have a heap of fun with just this alone and really drill down into why things are popular over time. But the really powerful thing about Google Trends, I think, is the ability to compare two or more terms against one another. Suddenly you can start to see which term was more searched than the other at any point in time. And you can do it across any countries or regions, just like before. And if you're like me and you really like to win arguments, this becomes an invaluable tool. You can compare things, wildly different things even, and infer information about which is more popular and why. For example, and I really hate to use a sports metaphor, if I compare the Pittsburgh Steelers and the New England Patriots, which are two of America's biggest gridiron or American football teams, you can see how their interest compares over time. I really don't know anything about American football, but looking at this graph, I would guess that in around maybe January of every year, there's some sort of final. Now, I know enough to know that that's the Super Bowl, and then there's an off season clearly. So in May and June, almost nobody's searching for anything to do with these teams. You can also see which teams are a little more popular in searches by different parts of the globe. So it looks like the Australians, Brazilians, and Canadians are more interested in looking up the New England Patriots than the Steelers, whereas our US friends would be more likely to search Google for the Steelers. I don't know what that means exactly. Maybe someone can tell me in the comments below. But one thing I can see is that comparing year to year, there's a differing level of interest in the different teams. For example, a standout is in 2006, the Steelers had a much higher search volume towards January than the Patriots. So if I was a betting person, I would bet that the Steelers were in the Super Bowl that year or got very close. Same thing in 2007, it leans towards the Patriots, and you can kind of see there's alternating searches. So you can start to imagine all the different ways you could use this functionality to compare two different topics. So that's what I want to do with you today. I'm going to take us away from sports land and back into knitting land, and we're going to look at some knitting related terms that often get tossed around as kind of different alternatives, and maybe people like to argue that one way is better than the other. I think we should look at the search popularity and use that as a bit of a proxy as to which one is more popular. A lot of us are creatures of community, so we want to be doing what other people are doing. I know not everyone's like that, but it's often just interesting. We have an innate need to know what other people are liking, and that really flows into a lot of different areas. So knitting styles, yarns, notions, constructions, whether things are more popular now than they used to be. And I think this would be an interesting kind of mostly unbiased way to look at that data. It goes without saying that this data here really isn't the end-all be-all. This just reflects what people were searching Google for at any given time. It doesn't include any other resources like other search engines or in-person classes, books, forums. And it shows that relative search popularity, it's a bit obscured. It's not the raw search volumes. Also, these graphs will include some kind of noise. So it'll include random spikes of interest where something was in the news and something prompted a bunch of people to search for it. And it also includes terms that are searched more out of infamy than popularity. So just because people are searching for something does not necessarily mean that they agree with it or that they like it. They're just interested in having more information about it. So maybe it's actually not that well known of a term or a technique, and it's being searched for that reason. You can also influence the results in Google Trends pretty easily with some tricks of wording. Is following the wisdom of the crowd really a good thing? I mean, I think it's interesting to look at, but you could really go down a rabbit hole here and spend a lot of time looking into something that just maybe doesn't align with your values or isn't important to you. Ultimately, it's up to you what you decide is popular and what you decide is worth pursuing for that reason. All that aside, do I think it would be fun to put in some comparisons and see what we get? Yes. So I'm going to do it anyway, and let's go. We have to start off with arguably the biggest debate in the vibe arts world. And even though I do both myself, people constantly talk about, is knitting or crochet better? We're going to use popularity as a proxy for what is better. So here are the results for knitting versus crochet worldwide from 2004 till now. There's so much to talk about here, honestly. To start off with, knitting is in blue and crochet is in red. 20 years ago, it looks like knitting was a more popular search term than crochet. But in around 2009, those kind of converged and then it went the other way. And so since 2009 to now, crochet has had a steady but pretty significant incline as compared to knitting, which has actually declined over time. So you could say that crochet is having a moment, but I think a lot of people like to say that as if it's only just the past year or two that people have really been into it, especially on things like TikTok. But you can see here that that's just not true. Since about 2015, crochet has been at a real peak. And as we saw with yarn, there is a big spike in the colder months in the Northern Hemisphere and then dips in the summer months in the Northern Hemisphere. And I'm certain that would flip around if we drill down into the Australian graph. Yeah, so it goes the other way around. In June and July, we are all freezing and knitting. You can see a similar swap. Looks like in Australia, the switch over from knitting being more popular than crochet was actually a few years later. Trends tend to trickle down here a couple years later, led by the US and Europe. It's just interesting seeing that, I guess, in a graph. So if we go back to the worldwide graph and we look at the regions, you can see that crochet is more popular than knitting in almost everywhere. And over on the right, we can look at a list of the countries that are more interested in knitting versus more interested in crocheting. So it looks like Bangladesh is our #1 knitting over crochet country. So if we click on it, there's not a lot of search data. So this is another thing to consider with Google Trends. Some smaller places or places that don't have as many people using the internet might not have enough data to be reliable. So if I go back, I would say that New Zealand would have a decent sized internet using population. So let's have a click on New Zealand. Yeah, interesting. So in New Zealand, I guess that switch between knitting and crochet never really happened. Knitting is, or except maybe in the past year. So that's really interesting. And there's a huge increase in the popularity of knitting in the wintertime versus crochet, which only gets a little bit of a boost every winter. So maybe you could take that to mean that people aren't crocheting garments. They're maybe crocheting more homewares that are a little bit less seasonal. And I'll drill into the United States. There you go, similar to the worldwide graph. I mean, the United States makes up a large portion of Google search users, so often the United States and the worldwide graphs are similar. And you can see that every single state finds crochet more interesting than knitting at the moment. So I think it's safe to say that right now crochet is more popular than knitting. It has been for quite some time. And even if you average it out over the past 20 years, crochet is almost twice as popular when it comes to searches on Google. Okay, let's move on to a different topic. I want to compare acrylic yarn versus wool yarn. This is a really hot topic in the knitting and crochet community. A lot of people have a lot of thoughts about why they prefer using natural fibers over synthetic fibers. But let's just have a look at what the data tells us about what people are searching for. I hope I don't have to explain to you that this graph is telling us that wool yarn is by far a more popular search than acrylic yarn by a huge margin. It looks like, yeah, at about sixfold. Almost every country on this list has a preference for wool yarn except for Ethiopia, which has a relatively low search volume. This was a real surprise to me. I think that a lot of beginners tend to use acrylic yarn, and I thought that that would be reflected in the searches. People who are less familiar with knitting and crochet and yarn would be searching more on Google to find out more, but that's just not the case. I don't have too much more to say about this. It follows the same seasonal trends as the other searches we've seen. There is an interesting spike at November 2017 for wool yarn. If anyone out there wants to do some sleuthing and find out why that is, did something happen in November 2017? Let me know. I'd be really interested to find out. Oh, and there's also these related queries. So when it comes to searching acrylic yarn, people also search for cotton yarn, what is acrylic, acrylic for crochet, and baby yarn. Whereas when it comes to wool yarn, looks like they're actually searching for a couple of different brands. So Wool Warehouse, Wool and the Gang, super chunky and worsted. Now, in my mind, the next biggest knitting controversy has absolutely got to be continental knitting versus English style knitting. Looks like continental knitting has a significant advantage over English style knitting. I'll take out the word style just in case, but then you have to consider that people might be searching for English. So I don't feel like this is a fair comparison. So let me have a look at continental style knitting and English style knitting. Pretty low search volumes it looks like, so you can tell by the way that there's nothing and then there's a really high spike. It means we've gotten down into a niche where there's just not a lot of searching for it. So I'm not able to figure out a good way to compare these two terms. I think there's too much overlap with the name English style and all the other ways that people search for, English knitting. I think this is as close as we're going to get. And if you take this graph as gospel, this is telling us that continental knitting absolutely blows English knitting out of the water. If you think of a better way to compare these two terms, please let me know. I'd be really interested to try this again. Okay, next up on my list, I wanted to compare different construction styles. So first up, of course, is the first thing that people ask when they start knitting is what are those circular needles and what is knitting in the round? So a lot of people, especially if they were taught by their grandparents, I feel learn to knit on straight needles. And that's called knitting flat, whereas knitting in the round is going around and around on a circular pair of needles. And I hear a lot that knitting in the round has really picked up on popularity over the last couple of decades. Unfortunately, we don't have data going back past 2004, so we're kind of limited here, but you can see a really interesting kind of peak in interests for knitting in the round towards the mid-2010s. You can see here actually Iceland is the top country in terms of interest in this topic. However, they have pretty limited search volumes, so nothing we can trust there. Let's have a look at Canada. So yeah, Canada has a real interest in knitting in the round. A country that's popping up in terms of knitting flat is India. And looks like there is a massive spike in November 2005, for knitting flat in India. So I think that's throwing our results off. So I think it's safe to say that more people are searching Google for knitting in the round. I'd suggest that this is probably because it's a little bit unfamiliar to some people. Knitting flat kind of feels like the default, especially for older knitters who are maybe learning some new techniques now. They're probably searching the internet for knitting in the round to find out what that's about and whether they need new tools for it. Of course, I didn't even think about this. There's the related queries for knitting in the round are join in the round, how to join in the round, joining knitting in the round. So maybe that is part of the technique that people really need help with. And so that is fueling these searches for knitting in the round. So to me, the big construction debate in terms of sweater knitting is drop shoulders or raglans. Those are kind of the two basic sweater constructions that a lot of people start with. And as you can see here, raglan sweaters beat out drop shoulder sweaters by a fair margin, but it looks like in the past couple of years, drop shoulders have caught back up. In the mid 2010s, it was absolutely no competition, but it looks like the popularity of drop shoulders is creeping up. And raglans too, to be fair, both of those terms are really picking up over the last little while. I wonder if people are maybe becoming a little more aware of the different styles of construction. Maybe it's used in non-knitting contexts also. So I can see here that drop shoulder sweater is related to a search for Shein, the clothing manufacturer. And of course, raglan is often associated with like baseball style t-shirts. A drop shoulder sweater is hugely dominated by searches from the United States, whereas a raglan sweater is actually preferred by people in Canada. Another construction that we've got to talk about, of course, is the bottom-up sweater versus top-down sweater. No surprises to me, top-down sweater absolutely smokes bottom-up sweaters. It's been more popular for a longer time, and it's still more popular. It's rising. To be fair, bottom-up sweaters are rising a little bit in popularity, but nowhere near as much as top-down sweaters are. And the countries searching for these two terms look pretty similar. Now, going back to our knitting in the round discussion from a minute ago, I really wanted to see what was the most popular way to knit in the round. I thought the two methods of knitting in the round that would be interesting to compare might be magic loop and double pointed needles. It was a little tricky to find the right terms to compare these two. If you just search magic loop, you get a lot of crochet content. And double pointed needles don't really have a name for the technique. It's just a name for the tool. But this was the best comparison I could get. And you can see they're actually really, really close. I think double pointed needles pull ahead just a little bit overall, but they're pretty much even over the last few years. I guess double pointed needles were maybe a little more popular maybe 10 years ago. And there's an interesting split in which countries prefer magic loop. So a lot of European nations, so we've got France, Sweden, Norway, heavily prefer magic loop. Searches for double pointed needles are coming from Russia, Canada, the US, Australia, South Africa, and so on. Now let's talk about needles and notions. I see a lot of discussion about which are the best needles to knit with, and we all have our own preferences, but there's obviously a few front runners. To me, the ones I hear about all the time are ChiaoGoo and Addi needles. Now, this is a really interesting graph. So up until the late 2010s, Addi needles were in the lead. For a while, they were the only searched term. ChiaoGoo didn't have enough volume to even appear on the searches. It'd be interesting to find out when ChiaoGoo was founded, because it looks like they kind of came on the Google scene in 2011. But even when they started being searched for, they were still nowhere near as popular as Addi needles, which I understand are really popular in Europe. But in the last couple of years, things have evened out, and then in the last just year, the searches for ChiaoGoo needles have absolutely skyrocketed. So whether that's driven by influencers who use them and promote them, or just word of mouth from people who have now tried them out and are really loving them, it looks like ChiaoGoo is really taking the lead. And interestingly enough, it doesn't seem like this is really split by region, but rather that over time, a lot of different countries have made the switch towards ChiaoGoo needles. So if I dive into a couple different places, so let's have a look at Canada. Yeah, so a much lower search volume, of course, but ChiaoGoo is still in the lead this year. Let's have a look at Australia. So yeah, very little searches for ChiaoGoo until the last couple of years. Of course, the United States, interestingly enough, our North Dakotans, any North Dakotans out there, you guys prefer ChiaoGoo needles over Addi needles, apparently, according to the data. Now, there's so many other brands you could really look into, and you can compare more than two terms at once, so you could go pretty wild here. But yeah, it's interesting. It reflects my experience, which has been that I've been hearing a lot about ChiaoGoo needles. I bought some myself. I love them. And that doesn't seem like a coincidence. It seems like it's more than just me. More people are talking about ChiaoGoo needles lately than Addi ones. Now let's look at sock constructions. So the two major sock constructions, of course, are toe-up socks and cuff-down socks. I gave it a chance, but the cuff-down sock really doesn't get any searches. There's no other way I could think of to phrase this, to see if there was any interest in this term. There isn't even enough data to show me any sort of related queries. So it seems that nobody's searching for a cuff down sock. Maybe that's considered to be the standard. It's just, knit socks are knit cuff down, and then toe up socks are the exception. And so people have to search explicitly for toe up socks in order to get those patterns. Yeah, this was really surprising to me. You can see also that the toe-up socks are trending down over time too. So maybe they're losing popularity. But in the competition between toe-up socks and cuff-down socks, toe-up socks win by far. Let's talk about short rows. Maybe it's just the patterns that I knit, but everyone can't stop talking about German short rows. Those are the short rows that I use. I find them really easy, they look seamless, but I've heard a lot about other kinds of short rows, in particular the wrap and turn. So I thought I would put these to the test, and really surprisingly, wrap and turn came out on top by far. I was concerned that results from other kind of queries were coming up, but you can see here that in the related queries section, knitting, wrap and turn, and knitting comes up. So Google seems to understand that this is a knitting related query. But yeah, I was just so surprised at how recently German short rows have kind of come on the scene. It looks like in about 2013 they started getting searches, and they have really risen in popularity. And again, over the past year, they have risen hugely. Wrap and turns have kind of been pretty level for the past 10 years or so. So maybe they're losing their chokehold, and maybe the German short row is the new trendy way to do turns in knitting. Now friends, we've reached my final comparison. I wanted to do something really fun for this last one, and I thought, let's compare some big designers. So I went on Ravelry and I looked at the most popular patterns on there of all time. And I took the first 5 or so well-known designers and I chucked them into Google Trends. And this is what we get. Now, I've got to be honest, I started with Petite Knit and I was looking for a different designer that could kind of compete to make the graph a little bit more even. And guys, they don't exist. Petite Knit has gone crazy on the internet. I'm sure you already knew that, but it's really interesting to see it so plainly. Even compared to some really big popular knitters, Tin Can Knits, Isolde Teague, The Crazy Sock Lady, and Pearl Soho. Petite Knit, who really arrived on the scene not that long ago in comparison. So this purple line here is Pearl Soho. They have been getting search volume in Google since 2007, if not earlier. And similarly, the others, Isolde Teague has been designing for quite some time. Tin Can Knits also. Petite Knit pops out of nowhere in 2018 and then rises like crazy. Within about 2 or 3 years, she's getting more than triple the search traffic of anyone else, and that's being generous. And in the last year, it's just gone even crazier. So I know we're at the peak of knitting season in the Northern Hemisphere, but her relative interest over time is at 100 now. So this is the most popular she's ever been. The most popular out of any of these designers. And yeah, so the rumors are true. Petite Knit is the most popular knitting designer out there that I can find. If I haven't compared someone who you think might give her a run for her money, please let me know. And there's a bit of an interesting breakdown by region. So Pearl Soho still has a grip on the United States, Canada, and Australia. So we'll drill down into there. You can see that Pearl Soho has a longer history and a stronger history of searches in Australia. But Petite Knit, this blue line, is coming up. I think in a couple of years' time, that's going to change. Whereas in Europe, Russia, Petite Knit is taking all of the searches. So let's have a look in Germany, for example. It's even stronger favor of Petite Knit. Some of the others get barely any search traffic from some of these European countries. It's also really fun to see what people are looking for. So I think a big contributor to Petite Knit's popularity, apparently especially in Greenland, is her yarn. So I know that she has worked with Sandnes Garn to release like a Petite Knit cross Sandnes Garn yarn line. So I think maybe that's a big driver of some of the searches for her. You can see here that people are searching for yarn, Sandnes, and Sunday, which is a Sandnes Garn yarn. So I've got to assume that a lot of the popularity behind her is also to do with her yarn. Tin Can Knits gets a lot of searches for their flax sweater, which I believe is a free kind of beginner friendly sweater pattern. A lot of searches for Ravelry. Isolde is associated with rivalry. Crazy Sock Lady is associated with her vanilla sock pattern, which I've heard a lot about. And Pearl Soho is a bit more general, so they're associated with patterns, hats, blankets. Unfortunately, they're associated with the pearl stitch, which makes me a little nervous about the quality of the data here and whether some of these searches are just related to pearl stitches and not Pearl Soho. Now, sadly, everyone, that's all I have for now. I really racked my brains for the things that I wanted the answers to, but I'm sure that I've missed some things. I'm sure there are some people out there who are screaming through their screen like, why didn't you compare this and this? Sorry about that. Please let me know in the comments and I can do another one of these comparison videos very happily. Oh, and I'll make sure I put all the links to all of these Google Trends pages down in the description. So feel free to click on those and have a little bit of a poke around. There's definitely way more ways you can slice and dice this data. And I'm interested if you come up with any other conclusions that maybe I miss or I misinterpreted. I'm also interested if there are any knitting trends over time that you'd like me to look into. I'm thinking of doing a couple of videos diving a little bit deeper into some of the data behind knitting trends over time. So put all your ideas in the comments. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about what you were surprised by, what you weren't surprised by, and I will get to your ideas next time. See you then.